Eleanor Whitmore had never been a woman of extravagance. Her life was defined by simplicity, quiet dignity, and an unshakable belief in family. At 60 years old, she lived in a quaint stone cottage on the outskirts of Alderbrook, a town known more for its antique shops and sleepy tea houses than for ambition or betrayal. The walls of her home were lined with books she'd read and reread over decades. Her garden bloomed with lavender and marigolds, and the fireplace was always warm with the soft crackle of wood, no matter the season. She had no children of her own but had devoted her life to caring for others, especially her late husband Gerald, during his battle with cancer, and later her brother's daughters, Sophie and Cassandra. After he died unexpectedly in a car accident, Eleanor had never questioned her place in the family. After her father's death, she did not expect riches or lavish properties. Only a letter, perhaps, or a memento to show he had thought of her. Her father, Arthur Whitmore, had been a stern but loving man, practical, disciplined, and deeply principled. He built a modest fortune from his printing business and was admired in Alderbrook for his generosity and fairness. Eleanor assumed, perhaps naively, that fairness would extend into his final will. So, when Arthur passed and the family gathered in the lawyer's office, Eleanor sat quietly in her navy coat, hands folded in her lap, waiting for her name to be spoken. It wasn't the lawyer. A man named Lionel Beckwith, who had represented Arthur for over 20 years, read the will with a mechanical rhythm. Sophie and Cassandra were mentioned immediately. Each was to receive a substantial portion of Arthur's estate, including the large family home, a portfolio of stocks, and several valuable heirlooms. There was no mention of Eleanor, not even a line of gratitude, a note, or an acknowledgement of her decades of service and devotion to the family. She sat there frozen, hearing the words but not believing them. Lionel's eyes briefly met hers. As he closed the folder, she looked away quickly, embarrassment crawling up her neck like ivy. Sophie leaned over and whispered something to Cassandra, and both suppressed a laugh. Eleanor noticed but pretended not to. She didn't want to make a scene. She left the office with a gracious smile, declining the offer of a ride back. She walked through town slowly, unsure if the tightness in her chest was heartbreak or just the beginning of realization. People passed her by, unaware of the storm brewing quietly within the woman who had spent her life giving and expecting nothing in return. For weeks after the will reading, Eleanor tried to convince herself there must have been a reason. Perhaps Arthur thought she was self-sufficient. Perhaps he had left something for her elsewhere, in a letter or a trust that hadn't been mentioned. But no call came, no letter. Sophie and Cassandra, now brimming with new wealth, began to distance themselves. They stopped visiting. Their calls became rare. When they did speak, it was filled with condescension, masked as concern. "Aunt Eleanor, we know things are tight for you," Sophie said once. "Let us know if you need anything." Eleanor never asked, but she watched. She noticed how quickly their lives changed. Sophie traded her modest car for a gleaming Mercedes SUV. Cassandra started flaunting designer handbags on her social media. They posted pictures from luxury resorts and rooftop bars, a lifestyle neither could have afforded before Arthur's death. At first, Eleanor told herself not to be suspicious. Perhaps they were just being irresponsible with their inheritance. But the more she saw, the more it stung. She had been the one by Arthur's bedside during his final months. She had cooked his meals, managed his medication, and read to him when he was too weak to open his eyes. Where were Sophie and Cassandra then? Where were they when Gerald was dying and Eleanor needed help? It wasn't just the betrayal that hurt, it was the feeling of being erased. All those years of love, of care, of loyalty meant nothing when it came time to divide what was left behind. The house she now lived in, modest and aging, needed roof repairs and a new furnace. Eleanor began budgeting more tightly than ever. She sold off some of her antique silverware. She stopped going to the Thursday poetry club in town, not wanting to spend on the tea and cakes. She started skipping dinners, having toast and tea instead. One afternoon at the local market, she ran into Cassandra, who was wearing a silk scarf and diamond earrings. "Still shopping here?" she asked Eleanor with a smirk. "You really should try that organic place downtown." Eleanor smiled politely, the humiliation scorching her beneath her skin. It was around this time that Eleanor began to have strange dreams of her father standing in the garden, holding a piece of paper. She'd reach out for it, but he would always disappear just before she could take it. It was foolish, she knew, but it unsettled her. The dream repeated itself night after night until one afternoon. While cleaning her attic in search of an old photograph album, she came across a small wooden chest she didn't recognize. It was tucked behind stacks of books and holiday decorations, dusty and bound with a faded leather strap. Inside was a bundle of letters, some from her mother, some from her brother, but buried at the bottom, wrapped in a yellowing handkerchief, was an envelope with her name on it. Asterisk. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. The handwriting was unmistakably her father's, neat, firm, and unambiguous. The letter began with an apology. He regretted the distance that had grown between them over the years. He acknowledged that he had not always been fair to her, especially after her marriage to Gerald, which he had once opposed. But he said he had come to admire her quiet strength and dedication. He wrote that he had revised his will 2 years before his death to ensure she would be taken care of. Enclosed with the letter was a photocopy of that revised will. Asterisk. In the revised version, Eleanor was listed as the primary beneficiary, inheriting nearly 70% of the estate, including the family house, the business shares, and a generous trust. Her nieces were still named but given smaller, though still significant, portions. The date on the revised will was clear. It was more recent than the one read by Lionel Beckwith. Asterisk. For a moment, Eleanor couldn't breathe. The truth pressed against her chest like a weight. Her father had not forgotten her. He had loved her. He had seen her sacrifices. But someone, most likely the very girls she helped raise, had hidden this from her. She sat there for hours, the letter in her lap, the sun setting outside, the attic filled with dust and memories. The betrayal cut deeper now. It wasn't just about money. It was about deception, theft, and being treated as disposable by those she once considered her own children. Asterisk. That night, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, a cup of untouched tea beside her. She didn't cry. Not yet. Instead, she began listing names, dates, and events on a notepad. She needed help, legal help. She didn't know much about courts or lawyers, but she knew how to research. She had spent a lifetime in libraries. After all, and if there was one thing she had learned from all the books she had ever read, it was this: every story had a turning point. Every underdog had a moment where they stopped being passive and started fighting back. And tonight, Eleanor Whitmore quietly decided this was hers. Asterisk. Eleanor stood on the edge of her garden, her gloved hands resting gently on the handle of the shovel she had been using to plant spring tulips. The earth was soft beneath her feet, and the morning air carried a chill that settled deep into her bones. But it wasn't the cold that made her pause mid-motion and stare off into the distance. It was the memory, fresh, bitter, and unrelenting, of the life her nieces were living while she, the rightful heir, remained in quiet exile. It had been weeks since she discovered the hidden will from her father, and every day since then had brought a new level of clarity. The betrayal she once only suspected now felt undeniable, deeply etched into her reality like a scar that refused to fade. Asterisk. Her relationship with Sophie and Cassandra had always been a complicated dance of affection and subtle imbalance. As children, they adored Eleanor, tugging on her skirts, begging her to read bedtime stories, crawling into her lap when storms frightened them. After their parents died, she had poured every ounce of maternal instinct into raising them. She gave up dreams of travel and late career promotions just to ensure they had stability. She had sold her jewelry to help pay Sophie's university tuition and cashed in a retirement bond to help Cassandra attend a prestigious writing workshop overseas. At the time, she did it without hesitation. Family meant sacrifice. Or so she had believed. Asterisk. Now, Eleanor found herself watching them from the shadows of her modest world, wondering if they had ever truly seen her as more than a temporary convenience, a stepping stone on their path to comfort. They never came to visit anymore, unless it was out of sheer obligation. Birthdays were now acknowledged with hastily typed text messages or automated e-cards. The warm, handwritten notes and Sunday dinners were things of the past. It was as if, once their grandfather's money had passed hands, Eleanor's usefulness had expired. Asterisk. Still, she had said nothing. Not to them, not yet. Asterisk. She began to quietly track their public lives, something that felt uncharacteristically invasive, but increasingly necessary. Social media, once a blur of harmless pictures and cat videos to her, became a window into the world they thought she would never see. Cassandra, now calling herself Cass for professional flair, had launched a blog called Modern Legacy, where she wrote about sustainable luxury living. The irony wasn't lost on Eleanor. Posts about reusing heirlooms for icodecor were laced with pictures of imported chandeliers and marble cups. Sophie had opened a boutique wellness center downtown complete with yoga retreats, sound baths, and a juice bar that charged $12 for a glass of cucumber water. Eleanor remembered giving her an old sewing machine when she was 16, which Sophie sold weeks later to buy makeup. Every image, every post, every indulgent caption felt like a taunt, not because Eleanor envied their lifestyle, but because she recognized it for what it was, funded fraud. Their entire foundation of success was built on deception, on a theft so personal it cracked the very core of her faith in kinship. And yet, they walked around without guilt. They laughed at wine bars, smiled through photo shoots, and collected compliments like trophies, while Eleanor patched up her roof with tar paper and borrowed books from the library instead of buying her own. The contrast wasn't just material, it was spiritual. One evening, she attended a town council meeting. Though she had little interest in the agenda, she hoped to casually speak with Councilwoman Regina Hargrove, a former friend of Arthur's, and someone with insight into local legal resources. The meeting dragged on with discussions about potholes and zoning permits. But Eleanor waited patiently, sitting in the back in her burgundy coat, a quiet observer with an intent far more serious than the others around her. When the session adjourned, she approached Regina near the coffee table. "Regina," she said softly, "do you have a moment?" The older woman turned, her face lighting up. "Eleanor, of course I do. It's been too long." They exchanged pleasantries before Eleanor steered the conversation toward her father. "I'm trying to clarify a few things about his estate," she said. "You knew him well. Do you remember him ever expressing concern about his final arrangements?" Regina frowned slightly, the kind of expression that hinted at a memory bubbling beneath the surface. Yes, I do. He told me, not long before he passed, that he had made changes to ensure you'd be taken care of. He was very specific about that. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. "He did." Regina nodded. "Said he felt guilty for not appreciating you more. Thought your sacrifices deserved recognition. It surprised me when I heard Cassandra was the primary beneficiary. I assumed you would have received the house, at the very least." That confirmation, though informal, was enough to sharpen Eleanor's resolve. She met with Nathaniel Cole the following morning, the man whose card had arrived anonymously in her mailbox. His office was tucked into the second floor of a weathered red brick building downtown. The waiting room smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper. When she walked in, he stood to greet her, a tall man in his early 40s, with peppered hair and a calm, observant demeanor. "Miss Whitmore," he said, extending a hand. "Please, come in." She handed him the folder she had assembled with documents, photographs, the handwritten letter from her father, and the photocopy of the revised will. Nathaniel read in silence, his brow furrowing only once, briefly, as he studied the signature. "I'm going to be very honest with you," he said after several minutes. "This is not just suspicious, it's illegal. If this document is genuine and was overwritten or ignored, it means someone deliberately committed probate fraud. That's not a civil matter. That's criminal." Eleanor's mouth felt dry. "Do I have any legal standing?" Nathaniel closed the folder. "You have more than that. You have a strong case, especially if we can verify the signature, confirm the date, and trace how the current version of the will came into play. If your nieces submitted a different version knowingly, they could lose everything and potentially face charges." Eleanor wasn't prepared for how much that last part affected her. She didn't want them imprisoned. As much as she hated what they'd done, she still remembered the girls they once were, but they had crossed a line so severe that silence was no longer an act of love, it was submission. "What happens next?" she asked. Nathaniel leaned forward. "First, we conduct a handwriting analysis. Then we gather sworn statements from people like Regina, Harold Finch, maybe even Lionel Beckwith, if he's willing. If the revised will is validated and determined to be the most recent, we can file a petition to contest the probate. Once accepted, the court will reopen the estate case. And then," he paused, "we reveal the truth." Eleanor nodded slowly. "I want to move forward." As she left the office, a soft rain began to fall. She walked slowly, allowing the drizzle to settle into her coat. The streets of Alderbrook glistened under the gray sky. The bakery on the corner had a new sign. Children huddled under umbrellas as their mothers ushered them home. Life moved on, unaware of the quiet war that had just begun. That evening, Cassandra called. Hey auntie. Her voice rang with fake cheer. Just checking in. How are you? Eleanor's voice was steady. I'm fine. How are you, Cassandra? Oh, good. Busy, you know. Actually, Sophie and I were wondering if you wanted to come by for dinner next week. We've been meaning to spend more time together. Eleanor paused. The timing was too perfect. Either they sensed something or guilt had finally begun to haunt them, but she wasn't ready to reveal her hand. Not yet. That sounds nice, Eleanor replied. I'd love to. After the call ended, she sat in the silence of her kitchen. The letter lay on the counter, just as it had every day since she discovered it. Tonight, it felt heavier. Not with pain, but with promise. She looked around the room at the chipped teacups, the worn tablecloth, the faded curtains. Her home was humble, but now it pulsed with purpose. They had underestimated her, believed her too meek, too forgettable to ever fight back. But Eleanor Whitmore was not a woman easily broken. She had faced death, poverty, grief, and loneliness. Now, she would face betrayal, and she would do it with the strength only time, truth, and love can give. The wind outside howled like a beast in mourning as Eleanor sat hunched at her desk, every lamp in her small home casting golden halos of light against the dark. In front of her lay the battered chest she had discovered in her attic, its lid now wide open, its contents meticulously laid out like artifacts in a museum of betrayal. The letter from her father, carefully unfolded and read a dozen times, lay on top of the photocopy of the revised will, like a solemn oath of truth resting atop a monument of deception. It was quiet in the room, save for the ticking of an old clock that had once belonged to her grandmother. But within Eleanor, a storm churned, a mixture of disbelief, heartbreak, and now, an unfamiliar but rising heat, anger. For most of her life, Eleanor had learned to swallow pain with dignity. She had smiled through sorrow, comforted others while nursing her own wounds, and bore injustices with the grace her mother once told her was the mark of a truly strong woman. But this was different. This wasn't life's random cruelty or fate's unkind hand. This was calculated, premeditated, personal. She had spent the last few days moving through the motions of daily life while quietly observing, noting, remembering. Sophie had called again, inviting her to a yoga event at her wellness center. Eleanor had accepted politely but didn't go. Cassandra had sent her an email link to a blog post titled, Letting Go of What No Longer Serves You, and Eleanor couldn't help but let out a humorless laugh. These weren't gestures of affection, they were, she realized, symptoms of guilt trying to dress itself in the skin of kindness. That evening, she went to the local copy shop and made multiple duplicates of the letter and will. She wrapped one copy in a waterproof sleeve and hid it beneath a loose floorboard in the hallway. Another, she placed in her safe deposit box at the town's only bank. A third she gave to Nathaniel Cole during their second meeting, just in case something happens to the original, she said, her voice steady, her eyes steeled. Nathaniel was impressed. You think like someone who's been through war. I have, Eleanor replied. It just didn't leave scars where people could see them. Nathaniel explained that the next step was handwriting verification. They needed an expert to compare Arthur Whitmore's known handwriting to the signature on the revised will. Eleanor provided letters, old birthday cards, and a signed first edition of a book he'd gifted her years ago. I have no doubt it's his signature, she said. He wrote that with a steady hand and a clear heart. The process would take a few weeks, but Eleanor wasn't idle in the meantime. She continued gathering evidence not just of the will, but of the girls' lives. She took pictures discreetly. Sophie's new Range Rover parked outside the spa, Cassandra arriving at a gallery opening in a silk dress with pearl buttons, the public listings of the properties they had purchased under shell companies. It wasn't difficult. Their success had made them careless. One afternoon, while organizing a box of photo albums in her closet, Eleanor stumbled upon a framed photograph from 15 years ago. It was a candid shot from Sophie's high school graduation. Sophie was in her cap and gown, beaming, flanked by Cassandra and Eleanor. Arthur stood behind them, his hand resting firmly on Eleanor's shoulder. pride unmistakable in his smile. Eleanor traced the frame's edges with her fingers, wondering how that version of their family had turned into this. Asterisk. She sat on the edge of her bed and thought about forgiveness. Could she ever forgive them? Was that even something she wanted to consider? She'd always believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt, but there was no misunderstanding here. They had stolen not just money, but a piece of her life, a chapter that should have been lived differently, more comfortably, more joyfully. They had denied her peace and instead given her pity disguised as kindness. Asterisk. No, she thought, forgiveness could wait. Truth had to come first. Asterisk. She decided to visit the lawyer who had read the fake will Lionel Beckwith. He was semi-retired now, his office smaller and tucked behind a row of medical clinics. When she arrived, he looked startled. Eleanor, it's been a long time. Asterisk. Yes, she said, shaking his hand firmly. I need to talk about my father's estate. Asterisk. He shifted in his seat uncomfortably as she sat across from him. I've heard some rumors, he said, clearing his throat, that there's another will. Asterisk. There is, she said, pulling out the copy. And I'd like to know how you didn't know about it. Asterisk. Lionel took the document and examined it for several minutes, his eyes narrowing. This looks like Arthur's handwriting. The date, this is definitely more recent than the one I read. Asterisk. So you didn't know? Eleanor asked. Asterisk. He sighed. I didn't. Cassandra was the executor. She submitted the other version and said it was the final copy. There was no reason to doubt her. Asterisk. She lied, Eleanor said. They both did. Asterisk. I see that now, Lionel admitted. Arthur was a principled man. He wouldn't have cut you out, not after everything. He told me once that you were the one constant in his life. Asterisk. Eleanor took a long breath. I need you to be ready to testify if this goes to court. Asterisk. Lionel hesitated, but then he nodded. For Arthur and for justice, I will. Asterisk. Outside, the wind had picked up again. As Eleanor walked down the quiet sidewalk, she felt the burden of years begin to shift, if only slightly. For the first time since the reading of the false will, she felt like someone believed her, stood with her. That truth, once buried, now had legs, and it was moving. Asterisk. The following week, the handwriting analysis came back. It confirmed what Eleanor already knew. The signature on the revised will was authentic, and the document was real. Nathaniel filed a formal probate challenge on her behalf. Cassandra and Sophie were served notices, delivered not by mail, but in person by an officer at their doorstep. The storm that had been silently building finally broke. Sophie called first. What the hell is going on, Aunt Eleanor? Her voice wasn't sweet anymore. It was sharp, cornered. Asterisk. I think you know, Eleanor replied. The truth is coming out. You have no idea what you're doing, Sophie snapped. I know exactly what I'm doing, Eleanor said. I'm taking back what's mine. Asterisk. Cassandra emailed that night. It was long, rambling, and full of excuses. She blamed grief. She claimed confusion. She said Eleanor was overreacting, and that family shouldn't drag family into court. Eleanor wrote back one sentence, family doesn't erase family for money. And then she blocked her. Asterisk. It was a small act, but a powerful one. Asterisk. As news spread through Alderbrook's tight-knit community, whispers turned into discussions, and those into opinions. Some were sympathetic to the girls, but most especially those who knew Eleanor stood by her. She had always been seen as gentle, quiet, reliable. No one could imagine her doing something like this without cause. Even the town's newspaper editor called her to ask if she would give an interview. She declined. Let the facts speak. Asterisk. Eleanor's house, once a symbol of her quiet retreat from the world, now felt like a fortress, not of war, but of justice. She cooked her meals, read her books, tended her garden, and waited. She didn't stalk their social media anymore. She didn't care what parties they attended, what shoes they wore, or who still followed them. The game had changed. Asterisk. Late one night, as she stood at her kitchen sink washing a teacup, Eleanor looked out into the darkness. The stars twinkled faintly above, indifferent to the struggles of humanity, and yet she felt something deeper, a sense of alignment, of the universe gently correcting a crooked path. Asterisk. They thought I'd stay silent, she whispered to no one, but I was never voiceless, just patient. And now, her patience had found its roar. The court date was set for a Friday morning in late spring, but Eleanor began preparing long before the official notice was delivered. The moment she filed the probate challenge and Cassandra and Sophie were served, everything around her shifted. The air in Alderbrook seemed to carry a new tension, subtle but undeniable. Neighbors offered her quiet nods of encouragement at the market. A few longtime acquaintances even stopped by her cottage under the guise of returning borrowed books or potted herbs. But their true intention was always clear. They wanted to hear the story, to know the truth from Eleanor herself. But she remained, tight-lipped, keeping the details private. This wasn't a spectacle. It was a reckoning. In the weeks leading up to the courtroom hearing, Eleanor's days were filled with a calm, methodical rhythm. She met with Nathaniel Cole every other day, each meeting sharpening the case they would present. Every piece of evidence was catalogued and rehearsed. The revised will, the signature analysis, the testimony from Lionel Beckwith, and the digital trails left behind by her nieces. Nathaniel had been thorough, collecting forensic financial records that showed exactly when Sophie and Cassandra's accounts began to swell within days of the probate conclusion. There were bank transfers, new property deeds, and purchases all tied to the estate. Most damning of all was the silence surrounding the original will. Not one legal or personal document showed any trace of it being submitted or contested. It had simply vanished until Eleanor found it one evening. After a long session at the law office, Eleanor returned home and stood for a moment on her front porch. Her tulips were finally blooming, bright and defiant against the soil, like they had something to prove. She thought about how many years she had spent planting flowers in the same spots, year after year, finding small joy in the familiar. But this year, everything felt different. These flowers weren't just a routine, they were symbols of persistence. Even buried, they found their way back to the surface. Inside, she made herself a cup of tea and opened her old journal. She hadn't written in it since Gerald's passing, but now she felt compelled to record everything, not for the world, but for herself, for the version of her that once accepted being overlooked. Her first entry was simple. This is not about revenge. This is about reclaiming what was never yours to give away. The night before the court hearing, Eleanor slept lightly. She woke at 4 a.m. and stared at the ceiling in the dim light of dawn. Her mind replayed every moment since the funeral, every fake smile, every slight, every cruel omission. She had loved those girls as her own, and they had carved her out of their lives with surgical precision, but not anymore. Today, they would face her not as the quiet aunt who tucked them in and packed their school lunches, but as the woman they tried to erase and failed. By 7:30 a.m., she was dressed and ready. She chose a charcoal gray dress with a modest pearl brooch that once belonged to her mother. Her silver hair was neatly pinned, her posture tall. When she arrived at the courthouse, Nathaniel was waiting. "You look formidable," he said with a respectful smile. "I feel ready," she replied. The courtroom itself was modest. Alderbrook wasn't a town of grand legal proceedings. The judge, a woman named Honorable Miriam Talbot, had a reputation for being meticulous and fair. The gallery was nearly full. Word had gotten out, and though the townspeople pretended not to gawk, their curious glances gave them away. Sophie and Cassandra arrived 10 minutes late, both dressed in designer suits, their expressions tight with frustration and denial. They didn't look at Eleanor. They didn't need to. Their eyes said everything. This wasn't supposed to happen. The case began with Nathaniel calmly laying out the timeline of events. Arthur's revised will, the absence of its submission to probate, the evidence of fraud, and the sudden change in the niece's financial status. He presented the handwriting analysis, which confirmed the legitimacy of Arthur's signature. He called Lionel Beckwith to the stand, and Lionel, with visible shame, admitted he had trusted Cassandra's submission and never asked questions. In hindsight, he said, that was a mistake. A grave one. Cassandra was called next. Her demeanor shifted from composed to defensive within minutes. She claimed she had never seen the revised will, insisted her grandfather left everything to her and Sophie, and suggested that Eleanor was misremembering things due to her age. That remark drew audible gasps from the gallery. Eleanor didn't flinch. Sophie followed, parroting the same line that they acted in good faith, that the submitted will was the only one they knew about. But Nathaniel produced damning evidence, a digital footprint of a scanned document with Arthur's name and a date matching the revised will opened on Cassandra's laptop the day after Arthur died. The metadata didn't lie. Judge Talbot looked over her glasses, her voice calm but firm. You expect the court to believe that you unknowingly ignored a valid, more recent will, yet coincidentally benefited to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars and made no effort to crush asterisk. Neither niece responded. The silence was thunderous. Asterisk. When Eleanor was called to the stand, the room stilled. She walked with grace, not bravado, and took her oath with calm clarity. Tell us, Nathaniel said, why you chose to pursue this case. Asterisk. She looked directly at the judge, not at her nieces. Because the truth matters, she said. Because love should never be repaid with betrayal. And because my father trusted me to carry on what he built. Not because I needed the money, but because he wanted me to have it. They stole that. Not just from me, but from him. Asterisk. There was a long pause after she finished. No one spoke. The judge finally nodded and asked a few routine clarifying questions. Then Eleanor was dismissed. Asterisk. The final statements were given, and Judge Talbot took a recess for deliberation. The room buzzed with quiet murmurs as people shuffled and stretched. Eleanor stayed seated, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't look at Sophie or Cassandra once. They, in turn, glanced nervously at her but said nothing. Asterisk. When the judge returned, she wasted no time. Asterisk. This court finds that the revised will presented by Ms. Whitmore is authentic, properly executed, and was unlawfully suppressed during the probate process. The court rules in favor of the petitioner. The estate of Arthur Whitmore shall be distributed according to the revised will. Furthermore, an investigation will be launched into the fraudulent submission by Ms. Cassandra and Ms. Sophie Whitmore, with possible criminal charges to follow. Gasps rippled through the room. Eleanor didn't smile. She merely closed her eyes for a moment, as if releasing a breath she had held for years. The world didn't shift visibly, but inside her, something seismic moved. Not triumph, not revenge, just truth finding its place at last. Asterisk. Outside the courtroom, Sophie and Cassandra stormed past reporters and townspeople, their faces tight with rage and humiliation. Eleanor watched them go, her heart beating slowly, steadily. Nathaniel placed a hand on her shoulder. It's done. Asterisk. She nodded. No, she whispered, it's just beginning. Asterisk. A week later, she received the official transfer documents. The family house, once her father's pride and joy, was now legally hers. It had been Cassandra and Sophie's residence for over a year, but the law was clear. They had 30 days to vacate. Asterisk. Eleanor visited the house one morning. She stood outside its large iron gate and remembered playing there as a girl, her father teaching her how to ride a bicycle in the gravel drive, her mother calling out from the porch with lemonade in hand. This wasn't just a property. It was memory, legacy, home. Asterisk. She didn't knock. She didn't call. She simply left the legal notice in the mailbox and walked away. Asterisk. By the end of the month, the house would be empty, and she would walk through its doors again, not as a forgotten aunt, but as the rightful heir to a legacy that tried to escape her. Asterisk. In the stillness of that moment, Eleanor realized something vital. She had not won. She had restored. And in that restoration, she had reclaimed not just what was hers, but who she was. Asterisk. The morning sunlight spilled through the tall arched windows of the grand house on Whitmore Lane, casting a golden hue across the polished floors. The scent of fresh paint still lingered in the air, mingling with the faint sweetness of lilies Eleanor had placed in a tall vase by the staircase. She stood silently in the entryway, hands folded, eyes tracing the intricate wooden banister she had once clung to as a child while playing pretend royalty. Now, after years of silence, betrayal, and battle, she stood as the owner, not merely in title, but in triumph. The mansion, stolen from her through deception, had finally come home, and with it, so had she. Asterisk. Sophie and Cassandra were gone. The 30-day eviction notice had expired just a few days earlier. Eleanor hadn't been present when they left. She had chosen to spend that day at the community library, reading poetry and sipping lukewarm tea. But when she returned, the locks had been changed by the sheriff's department, and all the furniture the girls had brought in was gone. Only the structure remained, the bones of the house her father had built with pride, restored to the hands he had originally chosen. Asterisk. Eleanor spent the next few days walking through the rooms, reacquainting herself with each corner like one would with a long-lost friend. She found her mother's hand-stitched cushions stuffed in a dusty linen closet. Her father's old typewriter was hidden away in the study, covered in a thick cloth. She ran her fingers over its keys and remembered the nights she used to hear the clack-clack of typing echo through the walls as Arthur penned his letters and notes. He had loved this house, and now she vowed to do the same, not out of obligation, but as an act of honor. The town was a buzz. Eleanor's quiet victory had become local folklore. People admired her composure, her unwavering pursuit of justice. She was invited to gatherings, asked to speak at the town's women's society, and even offered a segment on the local news. She declined the media attention, but accepted the community's kindness. Their recognition wasn't validation, had found that within herself, but it was a soothing balm after years of being treated as invisible. Nathaniel Cole continued to handle the legal aftermath. Criminal investigations into Sophie and Cassandra's fraudulent probate actions were underway. Eleanor had the option to press charges or settle privately. She struggled with the decision. Part of her believed justice would not be complete until they faced real consequences. Another part of her, after older, wondered if continuing to pursue them would simply entangle her in more bitterness. She sought counsel in the place she always turned to when unsure, her garden. Though the soil here was different from the one outside her cottage, Eleanor got to work restoring the long-abandoned flower beds that once bloomed under her mother's care. She spent mornings with her hands in the dirt and afternoons planning how to preserve the house's original charm. Her mind wandered often as she weeded and planted. She thought of Gerald, of her father, of the long nights she had endured alone, and slowly, she began to feel something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. But peace, Eleanor knew, didn't mean pretending the past hadn't happened. One afternoon, she received a letter. No return address. Just her name in a familiar slanted script inside, 3 short paragraphs, written in Cassandra's handwriting. I don't expect forgiveness. I'm not even sure I deserve to explain myself, but I wanted you to know that I'm sorry. I don't know what came over us. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was greed. But what we did was cruel. And it hurts me now in ways I can't put into words. I never thought you would fight. I underestimated you, and I am ashamed of myself. There was no signature, no request, just an acknowledgement. Eleanor folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. She didn't write back. A few days later, she stood in the living room, the one with the bay windows that overlooked the garden, and decided it was time to reclaim the space, not with extravagance or new furniture, but with meaning. She placed old family photographs on the mantel, ones she had rescued from albums at the cottage. She hung up a framed piece of embroidery her mother had made and brought over a bookshelf from her old home. Each item was a marker of continuity, not wealth. This mansion would not become a shrine to revenge, but a sanctuary of memory and strength. It was during one of these redecorating afternoons that she found a small box tucked behind the false panel of a drawer in her father's desk. It contained a collection of handwritten letters, notes from Arthur to her mother, to her brother, and several, surprisingly, addressed to Eleanor herself. Some were never sent. Some were heartfelt, others stern. But one letter, dated just weeks before his death, gripped her heart the most. Ellie. If you're reading this, it means you found what I couldn't say aloud. I was too proud, too late to fix things the way I should have. You gave this family everything, and I wanted you to have everything in return. I trust you to keep this home alive, not for me, but for yourself. Don't let them make you small. You are the roots of this family even if they tried to cut you out. She sat in the chair for a long time, holding that letter to her chest. Later that evening, she invited her old book club over. The women, Martha, Joanne, and Evelyn, had been her friends since before the betrayal. They arrived bearing cakes, wine, and wide-eyed admiration for the house. They walked through the halls like pilgrims, marveling at the artwork and the staircase. Ellie, you're glowing, Evelyn said, placing a hand on her shoulder. I'm just relieved, Eleanor replied with a gentle smile. It's been a long journey. They gathered in the sitting room, surrounded by books and lit candles, sipping wine and talking about literature, the local council drama, and their grandchildren. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt entirely present, not burdened by the past, not dreading the future. But even amid peace, Eleanor knew this chapter of her life had changed her forever. She had grown stronger, bolder, more self-assured. She wasn't the meek aunt who accepted scraps from the family table anymore. She had become the matriarch her father intended her to be, not just in inheritance, but in heart. Asterisk, she began to receive letters from other women in town, widows, retirees, even younger women, who thanked her for showing them what quiet courage looked like. One wrote, "You taught me that it's never too late to stand up for yourself." Another said, "My own children treat me like furniture. Watching you made me realize I deserve more." Asterisk, Eleanor didn't ask for admiration, but she accepted it. Not as praise, but as a signal that her story, painful though it was, had meaning beyond her own healing. Asterisk, she considered writing a book, not a scandalous tell-all, but a quiet memoir, about inheritance of land, of love, of dignity. She called Nathaniel to ask for legal advice about copyrights, and he encouraged her. "You've lived a powerful story, Eleanor," he said, "and the world could use more women who rise." Asterisk, she began writing the next morning, seated in her father's old study, using the same typewriter he once tapped late into the night. The first sentence she wrote was simple. "They tried to bury me, but I was the seed." Asterisk, as the days grew longer and spring turned into summer, Eleanor found herself filling the mansion with laughter again. She invited school children for reading sessions, held charity bake sales on the lawn, and began mentoring young girls in the town through a program she helped co-found Whitmore Women's Legacy Circle. Asterisk, she was no longer defined by what was taken from her. She was defined by what she reclaimed and what she built in its place. Asterisk, and so, each evening, when the sun dipped behind the hills and the shadows lengthened across the garden, Eleanor would sit in her rocking chair on the porch, sip her tea, and whisper a quiet truth to herself. "This is mine, not just the house, but the strength, the peace, the story. All of it is mine." Asterisk, the early summer mornings in the grand Whitmore estate had a stillness that Eleanor had grown to cherish. With windows cracked open to let in the fragrant breeze of blooming gardenias and honeysuckle, she would sit on the veranda each dawn, tea in hand, listening to the gentle hum of the town waking up around her. After years of silence, of being pushed to the margins of family and forgotten in favor of greed, these moments felt sacred. She was home, truly home, and yet she was beginning to understand that reclaiming a house was only part of the battle. Reclaiming a sense of self, of purpose, and of peace after betrayal was a much slower, more intimate journey. Asterisk, since the court's decision, Eleanor's days had been full. Restoring the house had given her a rhythm, but it was the subtle emotional repair that occupied her most. She spent long hours in the library, reorganizing her father's books, not because she had to, but because it helped her feel closer to him. The scent of old paper, the feel of worn spines under her fingertips, and the margin notes he scribbled in precise ink brought her comfort. She would pause sometimes and smile at the memories of debate they once had over a historical novel, his dramatic reading of poems during thunderstorms, the way he'd hum absent-mindedly while reading finance reports. Asterisk, but every comfort was mirrored by the shadows left behind. The absence of Sophie and Cassandra in her life was both a relief and a wound. Eleanor had loved those girls fiercely. Their betrayal still echoed in unexpected ways when she passed a bakery they once visited together, or heard a song they used to play while decorating the Christmas tree. These flashes of nostalgia, once warm, now felt like thorns pricking the edges of her calm. She didn't hate them. Hate would have been easier. What she felt was far more complicated, a mix of grief, disappointment, and something close to mourning. She had not just lost money or property, she had lost family. Asterisk, one afternoon, while sorting through the attic's forgotten boxes, Eleanor stumbled upon an old camcorder, the type that used miniature cassette tapes. With a small jolt of excitement, she took it down to the study and, after rummaging through drawers, found the charger. It took hours to power it up, but when the screen finally flickered on, a blue tint casting light onto her hands, Eleanor pressed play. The screen lit up with the past. There she was, 30 years younger, at Sophie's 6th birthday party. The camera swayed as someone laughed behind it. Arthur, most likely. Cassandra was toddling around in a pink dress, and Eleanor stood behind the cake, smiling, singing, guiding the girls with gentle hands. They looked up at her with adoration. Asterisk, as the footage played, Eleanor found herself leaning in. The sound of her own laughter, the sight of her brother smiling beside her, the genuine love in Sophie's eyes, none of it seemed fake. These moments were real. The betrayal hadn't erased them. She had loved those children, and at some point, they had loved her back. Maybe, she thought, Love can exist even inside stories with terrible endings. Asterisk, but the reflection brought something else. Clarity. Asterisk, she had spent so much of her energy preserving the estate, protecting her father's legacy, and standing up for justice. Now, it was time to think about what came next, not in terms of possessions or legal victories, but meaning. The house was hers. Her name was cleared. What would she do with this second chance? She started small. The garden became a project of passion. She dug new beds, planted vegetables, added fountains and stone pathways, but she also opened the gates, literally. Eleanor took out a newspaper ad inviting local women over 60 to spend Saturday mornings in her garden. No agenda, no pressure, just tea, plants, and conversation. She called it Bloom Again, a quiet reference to her own resurgence. Asterisk, to her surprise, a dozen women came the first week. They were retired teachers, widows, nurses, grandmothers. Some had lost husbands, others had lost homes. A few, like her, had been betrayed by their own families. They pulled weeds together, potted herbs, and slowly began to open up. Eleanor rarely spoke about her court case or the inheritance. Instead, she listened. And in their stories, she found pieces of herself. She wasn't alone. Betrayal, grief, loneliness, these weren't personal failures. They were part of life's cruel unpredictability. And healing, she realized, came from connection. Asterisk, one woman, Margaret, shared that her son had placed her in a retirement home without her consent. He said it was for my safety, she whispered, but really, he just wanted to sell the house. Eleanor squeezed her hand and nodded. She didn't offer advice. She just let her be seen. Asterisk, the Bloom Again group became a sanctuary. Eleanor turned one of the spare rooms into a craft space, another into a small reading lounge. The mansion, once filled with deception and exclusion, was now filled with laughter, kindness, and rediscovery. She hosted poetry nights, invited local authors to give talks, and worked with a social worker to start a small mentorship program for younger women in the community who had no family support. Asterisk, she didn't advertise it. She didn't post pictures. She didn't need recognition. She simply let the house become what it was always meant to be, a place where legacy was shared, not stolen. Occasionally, though, the past found its way back to her doorstep. One evening, just as the sun was setting, there was a knock at the door. Eleanor opened it and found Sophie standing there, alone, disheveled, her eyes red. For a moment, neither spoke. Asterisk, I didn't know where else to go, Sophie whispered. Asterisk, Eleanor stepped aside without a word, letting her in. They sat in the sitting room where, decades earlier, Eleanor had taught her how to read, helped her with homework, braided her hair. Now, they sat as strangers bound by memories. Asterisk, I messed up, Sophie said. I let greed decide who I was, and I lost everything. The house, my job, my friends, and now, you. Asterisk, Eleanor didn't cry. She didn't lash out. She simply listened. Asterisk, I don't expect forgiveness, Sophie continued, but I needed to say it out loud. Asterisk, for a long while, they sat in silence. Then Eleanor said, you didn't just betray me. You betrayed the girl I used to read bedtime stories to. You betrayed the version of you who once looked at me like I was her whole world. Sophie sobbed quietly. I don't hate you, Eleanor added, but I can't pretend it didn't happen. Healing doesn't mean pretending that wound was never there. Asterisk, Sophie nodded. I understand. Asterisk, they spoke for another hour, cautiously, like people walking across thin ice. And when Sophie left, she didn't ask to come back. She simply said thank you and walked out into the night. Asterisk, that night, Eleanor sat in her garden, looking up at the stars. She felt no vengeance, no triumph, just stillness. Asterisk, life had not been fair to her. It had taken things she could never get back, but in return, it had given her something more lasting, resilience, the kind of strength that grows silently, like roots under soil, until one day it breaks through into full bloom. Asterisk, she looked around at the garden, at the house she had saved, at the life she had rebuilt not alone, but through quiet determination and chosen community. Asterisk, she wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. Asterisk, and as the wind whispered through the leaves, she smiled softly to herself, knowing the most powerful revenge was never loud or cruel. It was becoming someone no one could destroy. Asterisk, not even family. Asterisk, the morning sunlight filtered through the high windows of the mansion, creating dappled patterns across the mahogany floors as Eleanor moved gracefully through the grand kitchen. The kettle began to whistle softly, and she removed it from the flame with a practiced motion, pouring hot water into her favorite porcelain teacup, a delicate piece her mother once cherished. The house was quiet but not lonely. It pulsed with life in its silence, filled with the echoes of purpose, of rediscovery, of peace, hard-earned. Eleanor, at 60, had never imagined this version of herself. For years, she had played the role of the quiet caregiver, the overlooked aunt, the dutiful daughter. Now, she was something else entirely. Not just the rightful heir to the Whitmore legacy, but a woman transformed. The mansion had slowly become more than just a home. It had evolved into a haven, a hub of quiet restoration for others as much as for Eleanor herself. The Bloom Again gatherings had flourished beyond her expectations. What started as tea and gardening with a few elderly women had grown into a collective of women supporting one another through every kind of loss: widowhood, abandonment, illness, financial ruin, emotional fatigue. Eleanor had never intended to lead a movement. She simply opened her gates and listened. That, she discovered, was enough. Her days became structured around purpose. Mornings were for tending the garden and replying to letters from women across town and, now, from other towns who had heard her story. Afternoons were for organizing events at the mansion, quiet lectures on resilience, poetry readings, financial literacy sessions, and even basic legal rights discussions. A retired lawyer named Gloria had volunteered to speak once a month about how to protect one's estate, something Eleanor knew too well could mean the difference between security and ruin. But amid this life of quiet momentum, Eleanor also began to confront emotions she had long suppressed. One evening, after everyone had left the house and the candles in the reading lounge had burned low, she wandered into the upstairs bedroom where her father used to sleep. The room had been untouched since she reclaimed the house. The dust had been swept away, the sheets replaced, but the energy in the room remained unchanged, a mixture of dignity, authority, and unspoken regrets. She sat on the edge of the bed, her eyes drawn to the old leather armchair by the window, where Arthur Whitmore used to sit with his paper and evening whiskey. She opened the top drawer of the side table, unsure of what she hoped to find, and discovered a small notebook bound in faded red leather. Inside were brief entries, scribbled thoughts, dates, and names. Her father had never kept a full journal, but he had made notes, ideas, financial reminders, quotes that moved him, and among them, Eleanor found a short paragraph written in surprisingly shaky handwriting. Ellie deserves more. I can see it now, how much I took for granted. She's the one who stayed, the one who sacrificed. If anything happens to me, I hope she knows I made it right in the end. I owe her that, more than I could ever express. Her eyes filled with tears as she gently closed the notebook. That sentence, those few words, undid something in her attention that had lived in her shoulders for decades. The ache of wondering whether her sacrifices had ever truly been seen. Arthur hadn't always said the right things. He had been a man of few words and many assumptions, but he had seen her. Eventually, he had seen her. Eleanor placed the notebook back in the drawer, whispering a silent thank you to a ghost whose silence had once hurt her and whose final words now healed her. As the weeks passed, she found herself reflecting more on the concept of inheritance, not in terms of land or money, but in terms of memory, character, and resilience. What did she wish to leave behind? Not just for family her bloodline had betrayed her, but for those whose lives now intersected with hers by choice and connection. She began writing again, a habit she had picked up shortly after winning the court case. But now, her writing was not just a personal memoir. She was crafting something larger, a collection of essays titled The House That Bloomed Again. Each chapter was dedicated to a theme: betrayal, silence, justice, healing, courage, and renewal. She wrote at night in the old study, tapping slowly on the typewriter Arthur had once used, each keystroke grounding her in the present while honoring the past. One day, as she edited her chapter on betrayal, she received an unexpected call. Eleanor, it's Cassandra. The name hit her like cold air, unexpected and sharp. I hope this isn't unwelcome. I didn't know who else to talk to. There was a pause. I'm listening, Eleanor said carefully. Cassandra explained she had started therapy, that she was working a modest job at a local arts nonprofit, that she had moved into a small apartment in a quiet part of town and was trying, for the first time, to live without shortcuts. "I miss you," she said finally. "I miss what we used to have before all this." Eleanor closed her eyes, weighing every word. "You miss what we had," she said slowly, "but you destroyed it, and now you want it back." "I want to rebuild," Cassandra replied. "Not for money, not for approval, just to make peace." There was a silence between them, not cold, but cautious. Eleanor knew what it meant to live with regret. She knew that real remorse was not performative, it was quiet, persistent, and willing to accept the consequences of harm. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again," Eleanor said, "but I don't hate you." "That's more than I deserve," Cassandra whispered. They didn't plan a reunion. No promises were made, but the door had opened, even if just a crack. Later that evening, Eleanor sat beneath the large oak tree in the garden, watching the last streaks of sunset bleed into the sky. She thought of the conversation, the pain, the decades of love that had been twisted by greed, and the uncertain thread of reconciliation now pulling at her life. She didn't know if she could forgive Cassandra, but she knew she could continue to grow. The Bloom Again program had now extended to include younger women, those in their 30s and 40s, struggling with difficult family dynamics, divorces, and career uncertainty. Eleanor began mentoring a woman named Priya, a single mother battling a custody case. Another woman, Joanne, had just escaped an abusive marriage and was rebuilding her life from scratch. Eleanor didn't offer them platitudes. She offered presence, space, kindness, and her story. One Sunday, at the end of a Bloom Again session, one of the younger participants hugged Eleanor and said, "You're the kind of mother I wish I had." The words struck deep, not with sadness, but with a quiet warmth. That night, Eleanor walked the halls of the mansion barefoot, her hands brushing along the walls. Every room now had new meaning. The ballroom had become a community hall. The dining room hosted shared dinners for women's groups. The upstairs library had turned into a sanctuary of books, blankets, and safety. This house, once silent and full of pain, now breathed with renewal. She paused at a window overlooking the garden and saw the women Margaret, Priya, Joanne laughing as they carried baskets of flowers inside. The lanterns hung from the trees cast a soft glow across their faces. Eleanor smiled. In their joy, she found her healing. Not from revenge, not from victory, but from purpose. She returned to her study and sat at her typewriter once more. A blank page awaited her. She began to write the next chapter of her book, starting with a single line. Sometimes, the people you love break you into pieces. But if you gather those pieces gently and plant them in the right soil, something stronger will bloom. And with that, she typed on, creating something not just for herself, but for every woman who had been overlooked, underestimated, or erased. She was Eleanor Whitmore, and her story was far from over. The morning sky stretched above the Whitmore estate like a calm ocean, blue and endless, as Eleanor stood on the front porch, gazing out across the garden. It had become a ritual, her quiet moments before the world awakened around her. These early hours, marked by stillness and clarity, gave her space to reflect on how drastically her life had changed. Less than a year ago, she had been a woman dismissed by her own blood, left to live out her twilight years in solitude and perceived insignificance. Now, she was something she had never imagined, the heartbeat of a movement, a beacon to women who had lost themselves in the chaos of family, betrayal, and neglect. But with growth came complexity, and Eleanor was beginning to realize that healing, while beautiful, was never linear. Her mornings had once been filled with chores, cooking, and reading. These days, they were busier. Calls from organizers, letters from women around the country, invitations to speak at conferences about intergenerational justice, elder abuse, and financial empowerment for women. A journalist from a regional magazine had even written a feature on the Bloom Again program, dubbing Eleanor the reluctant matriarch of a quiet revolution. The attention had been both humbling and overwhelming. Eleanor never sought fame, she simply wanted the truth to matter, and for dignity hers and others to be restored. The house, once eerily quiet, now buzzed with activity. On most days, it served as a community space. There were workshops on estate planning, cooking, classes for widows who had never needed to cook before, and even grief circles where people shared stories of love lost. Eleanor walked among them, not as a figurehead, but as one of them, a participant in the long, winding journey of resilience. But amid the laughter, the learning, and the new friendships, she began noticing a different kind of restlessness inside herself, an emotional fatigue that crept in during quiet hours, whispering unresolved thoughts into her ears. It came late at night, often when she sat by the fireplace with a book on her lap, but found herself reading the same paragraph over and over, or when she'd lie awake listening to the ticking of the clock, unable to stop herself from imagining the lives Sophie and Cassandra now lived beyond her view. She hadn't heard from Cassandra again since their last conversation. No further letters, no more calls. Sophie, as far as Eleanor knew, had not attempted contact at all. It was a strange feeling, not anger, not sadness, but a heavy kind of wondering. Were they still justifying their betrayal to themselves? Were they regretful? Did they miss her? Did they blame her? One afternoon, while sorting through donation boxes in the attic, Eleanor found a box of old letters and photos from when the girls were children. There were handmade birthday cards, shaky crayon drawings that read to Aunt Ellie, and faded Polaroids from school plays and beach trips. She sat cross-legged on the floor, slowly moving through each memory like a curator in a private museum. There had been so much love once, so much connection, and she couldn't understand how it had all unraveled so easily. She realized something then. She had been waiting for an apology that might never come, waiting for them to acknowledge what they did, not just with words, but with true accountability. And in that waiting, she had held herself back from a deeper kind of peace. It wasn't closure she needed, it was release, so she decided to write them letters. Not to send, just to write. She started with Sophie. She poured herself a cup of tea and sat at her desk, opening a fresh page in a cream-colored journal. She wrote slowly, intentionally. Sophie, there are days when I miss you more than I can explain. Not the woman you became when the money changed hands, but the little girl who once begged me to braid her hair and asked me to sit beside her when she had nightmares. That version of you is still etched into my memory, and I don't know where she went. I don't know if you miss her too. I often wonder what was going through your mind when you signed the false will. Was it a decision you made in panic, or did you genuinely believe I didn't deserve it? Either way, you chose to erase me, and it worked for a time, but I came back, not out of spite, but because truth matters. I hope one day, you find yours. She folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, then began writing to Cassandra. Cassandra, you once told me I was your safe place, that when your mother died, you felt like I was the only person who saw your pain. That's why what you did hurt, in a way no legal betrayal ever could. You didn't just take what wasn't yours, you made me feel like I had never mattered. And yet, when you came to me with trembling words and guilt in your voice, I saw a fragment of the girl I raised. I don't know if you'll return to that honesty again, but I know this. Healing doesn't need an audience. I am healing, whether you ever make things right or not. When both letters were done, Eleanor didn't feel lighter. Not immediately, but she felt clear. It was the beginning of another kind of letting go, not forgetting, not forgiving, but choosing not to carry what wasn't hers. In the following days, she found herself pulled into a new project. A young woman named Emily, a law student from a neighboring town, reached out with an idea. Inspired by Eleanor's story, she wanted to establish a foundation that offered free legal advice to elderly women facing estate abuse or familial manipulation. We can call it the Whitmore Justice Initiative, she proposed. If you're willing. Eleanor was speechless. The idea that her story could ripple outward into systemic change moved her deeply. She met with Emily, and they began the groundwork. A portion of Eleanor's inheritance would serve as seed funding. The rest would come from donors, most of whom had followed her story and wanted to help others avoid her experience. Within a few months, the foundation had a small team, a legal helpline, and a rotating staff of volunteer attorneys and social workers. It was real. It was helping. And yet, Eleanor's heart remained firmly tied to the people right in front of her, those who gathered in her home, sat at her kitchen table, planted beside her in the garden. One day, a woman named Lillian, newly widowed and clearly still in shock, came to the Bloom Again group. She barely spoke, just sat with tearful eyes and trembling hands. At the end of the session, Eleanor took her a cup of tea and quietly sat beside her. Asterisk, do you want to talk? She asked gently. Asterisk, Lillian shook her head, then whispered, I don't know who I am anymore. Eleanor took her hand. I didn't, either, she said, but you're not gone. You're just waiting to be found again. Asterisk, they sat together in silence, and Lillian began to cry softly, freely. Asterisk, moments like that reminded Eleanor why she had fought so hard to reclaim her life. It wasn't for the house or the money. It was for this, the power to sit beside another woman and say, I know this pain, but I also know what comes after it. Asterisk, that evening, Eleanor walked the halls of her home. Pausing at the mirror in the grand hallway, she looked at her reflection, gray hair tied back in a bun, face marked with lines of age and wisdom, eyes no longer dull with defeat but clear with purpose. She smiled, not because everything was perfect, but because she had survived and grown. Asterisk, before bed, she went out to the garden, now wild with lavender, roses, and sunflowers. She knelt in the soil and planted a new bulb, a white lily, symbol of rebirth. As she covered it with dirt, she whispered, grow strong, not just to the flower but to herself, because in a world where people once tried to bury her, Eleanor had become the seed that bloomed through every lie, every silence, every scar. Asterisk, and she was still blooming. Asterisk, the final chapter of Eleanor Whitmore's long, painful, and profoundly transformative journey began not with a grand event or announcement, but with a single, unassuming envelope that arrived one quiet morning. It was delivered without courier, no urgent stamp, just slipped through the brass mail slot in the thick wooden door of the Whitmore estate. Eleanor noticed it after breakfast, nestled between a flyer for gardening supplies and a letter from a local women's group, thanking her for a recent donation. She picked it up, turned it over, and paused. The handwriting was unmistakable, elegant, angular, and once familiar. It was Sophie's. Asterisk, her fingers trembled slightly as she opened it, not from fear, but from the weight of what might lie inside. She had prepared herself for many things in the past year, for silence, for bitter denial, even for a legal counterattack. But she had not prepared herself for genuine remorse. She had not dared to believe that Sophie, the niece who had once clung to her hand at the dentist's office, who had cried in her arms when she scraped her knees, might finally see what she had done and own it. Asterisk, inside. The envelope was a single sheet of cream paper and a handwritten letter. It was not long, but it was raw. Dear Aunt Eleanor, I don't know how to start this letter, or if I even have the right to send it. For a long time, I've lived inside a version of myself that I barely recognize anymore, a person I let greed and fear shape. I won't make excuses. The truth is, I knew what I was doing when I signed that forged will. I knew it wasn't right, but I justified it to myself in 1,000 ways, telling myself you'd be fine, that you didn't need it, that maybe you even expected to be left out. Lies I whispered to sleep at night. And now, here I am, wide awake. I lost everything, but I realize now, the greatest loss wasn't the house or the inheritance. It was you, the woman who raised me when my world shattered, the one who made me feel loved when I didn't know how to ask for it. I betrayed that love. I don't deserve forgiveness, but I needed to tell you, I am sorry for what I did, for who I became, for what I destroyed. Asterisk, whatever life you live now, I hope it's full of peace. You deserve that. You always did. Sophie. Eleanor read the letter once, then again, and finally a third time, each reading peeling back new layers of emotion. She felt grief for the girl Sophie used to be, sorrow for the relationship they had lost, and a soft, tentative hope for what this letter might mean. But most of all, she felt a release. The apology, long overdue, did not erase the past, but it brought something close to stillness, a quiet ending to a long chapter of anguish. Asterisk, she didn't reply immediately. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer with Cassandra's previous letter, alongside her father's final note and her own unsent letters to both women. That drawer had become a sacred space, a small archive of emotional history, containing the full arc of betrayal and now the faint beginning of reconciliation. Asterisk, in the weeks that followed, Eleanor focused on the present. The Bloom Again program had entered its second year. Membership had doubled. New volunteers arrived each week, some young and eager, others retired and wise. They painted benches, refurbished old chairs for the reading room, and helped design a community bulletin board covered in handwritten notes of encouragement, job postings, and shared recipes. Eleanor also continued her work with the Whitmore Justice Initiative, which had now partnered with 2 national organizations for elder advocacy. They were creating educational toolkits to help older women recognize financial manipulation and protect their rights. Eleanor's story had become the center of a documentary project filmed discreetly, with her permission, and set to be aired the following spring. But she had also begun carving out time for herself, real time, not the busyness that filled hours, but the quiet that nourished the soul. She resumed painting, something she hadn't done since Gerald passed. Her small art studio on the 2nd floor overlooked the garden, and she often lost herself in the soft strokes of watercolor, capturing flowers, skies, and sometimes even the silhouettes of women she admired. Each canvas told a story she didn't have to explain. It was all there, in the color. One particular morning, while sipping her tea and reviewing the next week's event calendar, she received a call from a familiar number. Aunt Eleanor. It was Sophie. "I hope it's all right that I called," she said cautiously. "I didn't expect a reply to the letter. I wanted to hear your voice." Eleanor sat down slowly. Her voice was steady. "I got your letter." "I meant every word," Sophie said. "I've been working on myself. I'm in therapy. I'm volunteering. And I'm rebuilding." "That's good," Eleanor replied. "It's what you need." There was a pause. "I don't expect us to go back to the way things were," Sophie said. "But if there's ever a way forward, I would be grateful." Eleanor looked out the window. The sun had broken through the morning fog, lighting up the lilies in the garden. "I don't know yet," she said honestly, "but I don't want us to stay in the past forever either." Sophie whispered. "That's more than I hoped for." After the call, Eleanor felt a surprising calm. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no flood of emotion, just 2 people on either side of a broken bridge, acknowledging the damage and, for the first time, not walking away from it. That evening, she wrote the final chapter of her memoir, The House That Bloomed Again. The chapter was titled The Door Left Open. Forgiveness, she wrote, is not the erasure of pain. It is the refusal to let pain write the last word. I do not know if I will ever trust them again, but I do know that love does not have to be loud to be real. Sometimes it is just a door left open, quietly, without ceremony, waiting for someone to walk through when they're ready. She signed the manuscript, set her pen down, and closed the journal. Her story, the one that began with silence and ended with voice, was complete. The next week, the town of Alderbrook held a ceremony honoring women in leadership. Eleanor was the final speaker. She stood at the podium in a modest navy dress, her silver hair pinned back, her voice strong but soft. I used to think that the most dangerous thing in the world was betrayal, she said, but I've learned that what's even more dangerous is forgetting your own worth. When others forget you, when they erase you, when they convince you that your silence is love and your sacrifice is invisible, that is when you must rise, not in anger, but in truth. The crowd stood. Applause thundered through the hall, and in the back row, unnoticed by most, stood Sophie. She didn't try to come forward. She simply watched, tears in her eyes, as the woman she had once betrayed became a symbol of unshakable grace. That night, Eleanor returned home to the mansion on Whitmore Lane. She stood in the garden beneath the stars, breathing in the cool, night air. She looked up at the sky, at the moon casting silver shadows across the lawn. She didn't feel victorious, she felt whole. Her journey had been long, twisting through betrayal, anger, justice, reflection, and healing. But now, she stood not as a survivor of loss, but as a curator of resilience. The inheritance that had been hidden from her turned out to be far more than property or money. It was strength, wisdom, the courage to speak, to stand, to stay soft. In a hard world. She whispered into the breeze, "You tried to bury me." Then she smiled, eyes glistening. "But I was the seed." And from that seed had grown a garden of strength, a house of light, and a legacy that could never again be hidden.